There is a recording from September of 1976 that most James Brown fans have never heard. Not a music recording, a documentation recording, the kind that venue crews sometimes made during large concerts to track production timing and technical events. On this particular recording, approximately 43 minutes into James Brown's performance at a large arena in the American South, there is a sound that does not belong in a concert tape. It is the sound of the music stopping, not fading, not ending with a resolution or a bow or any of the theatrical punctuation that James Brown used with such precision at the end of performances. Just stopping. And then, approximately 8 seconds of what sounds, through the distortion of an aging tape, like 12,000 people collectively holding their breath. For 30 years, the people who were in that arena, and the people who worked that night, and the people who had spent decades studying every available account of James Brown's career, could not tell you with certainty what had happened in those 8 seconds, or in the 20 minutes that followed, or why the hardest working man in show business had put down his microphone in the middle of a performance that by all accounts was extraordinary, and had walked off a stage without a word of explanation to anyone. Not his band, not his crew, not his audience, not his road manager, not his assistant, not anyone. He was asked about it, multiple times, over multiple decades, by journalists, by biographers, by interviewers who had done their research and knew that this particular evening represented an unexplained gap in the otherwise thoroughly documented history of a man who had performed thousands of concerts and had never, in any other recorded instance, simply walked off without cause or announcement or resolution. Every time he was asked, James Brown did the same thing. He heard the question. He acknowledged it with a slight movement of his head that was not quite a nod, and then he answered a different question, a question that had not been asked, about something adjacent to, but not the same as September of 1976. He did this so consistently and so elegantly that several interviewers did not immediately realize it had happened. They would review their transcripts later and find that they had left the conversation with 3,000 words of James Brown, and none of it was the answer they had come for. This is what he was protecting, and this is why, 30 years later, the protection finally ended. In September of 1976, James Brown was 43 years old. He had been performing professionally for more than 20 years. He had survived the impossible churn of an industry that consumes its artists, and was operating, by every external measure, at a level of sustained excellence that had never been matched in the specific form he practiced. 200 shows a year, minimum, each one full commitment, each one the complete and uncompromised version of what James Brown was, regardless of the state of the venue or the tour bus or his own physical body, or the particular anxieties of that period in his career. And there were anxieties. This is important to understand because the mythology of James Brown, the unstoppable, the indestructible, the hardest working man in show business, tends to obscure the fact that underneath the performance there was always a person navigating the same uncertainties that every person navigates, plus the additional uncertainties that are specific to being the person who has defined a genre and who watches the industry perpetually discovering new ways to declare that genre finished. By 1976, the music landscape was shifting in ways that James understood and that he managed through work, as he managed everything, by going on stage and proving, for 200 nights a year, that whatever else was happening in the culture, this was still real. The night in question was going exceptionally well. The sound engineers who were present and who later gave their accounts to a music historian named Patricia Rowe during her research in the mid-2000s described the first 40 minutes of that performance as among the best they had witnessed in years of working James Brown events. The crowd was fully engaged in the way that crowds are sometimes fully engaged and sometimes merely present. And the distinction is audible from the soundboard, even when you cannot see the floor. The band was locked in with a precision that even by James Brown band standards was notable. Everything was working. And then, 43 minutes in, something caught James Brown's attention on the south side of the stage. Not something on the stage, something beyond it. Through the wing, past the equipment cases and the hanging cables and the temporary walls of a touring production. Through the gap that opened into the building's loading area. A gap that James Brown's sightline, from his position at the front of the stage at that particular moment in that particular song, happened to pass through directly. The accounts from people in the wings that night, the stage manager, the lead sound engineer, 2 members of the crew who were doing equipment checks on the south side, converge on a single observation. In the seconds before James Brown stopped performing, his body changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that the audience would have noticed or that the cameras would have captured, because there were no cameras in a position to record it. But the people who were standing in the wings and who knew James Brown's body language the way that people who have worked in close proximity to a performer for years know it. They said that something in his posture shifted, a change in the direction of his attention, the kind of change that happens when a person's focus has moved from the space in front of them to a space to the side or behind, and the body is beginning to respond to where the attention has gone before the conscious decision to follow it has been made. He set the microphone on its stand. He turned toward the wing. He walked off the stage. What he had seen through that gap in the loading area on the south side of the building was a man in his early 60s, by the appearance of him, in clothing that had not held its condition well, sitting on the concrete floor between 2 equipment cases with his back against the wall and his head forward and his hands in his lap, in the specific position of someone who is not resting, but enduring. James Brown walked through the gap and into the loading area. He did not run. He walked at a normal pace, with the same purposeful and unhurried stride that carried him everywhere, and he stopped in front of the man on the floor, and he crouched down. His road manager, who had registered what was happening approximately 12 seconds after James left the stage, the delay accounted for by the initial incomprehension of watching something that had never happened before, followed. He came into the loading area and stopped at a distance that his professional instinct told him was the correct distance. Close enough to be immediately available, far enough to preserve whatever was happening. What he saw, from that distance and over the next 20 minutes, was a conversation. He could not hear most of what was said. What he could see was the posture of it. 2 men, one crouched and one seated on concrete, in the specific physical arrangement of people who are not performing for anyone and have no reason to present anything other than what they actually are. He could see that James Brown was asking questions and listening to the answers. He could see at a certain point that James stood and spoke briefly to one of the truck drivers who was on a break near the loading doors. The truck driver went inside. He came back several minutes later with food. The real food, the crew food, the substantial, unremarkable food that the people who do the physical work of a touring production eat. And James Brown took it and handed it to the man on the floor. He stayed while the man ate. The road manager, watching this, understood enough to understand that he did not understand enough. He had worked with James Brown for 4 years. He had been in rooms and on buses and in the aftermath of shows with him. He had seen James in many states and in many circumstances. He had not seen this. The quality of James's attention in that loading area was different from any quality he had previously observed. It was not the attention of a performer or a public figure or a man managing a professional situation. It was the attention of someone who was there completely, not managing the moment, not calculating its implications, not doing anything except being in it with the full weight of his presence. The food was eaten. James Brown stood. He said something final to the man on the floor. The road manager could not hear what it was. He watched James's face as he said it, and he said later that whatever it was not a pleasantry and it was not a dismissal. It carried, from 20 feet away, the specific quality of something that was meant to be heard and to stay. Then James Brown straightened his jacket, the small habitual gesture that preceded every moment of public presentation, and he walked back toward the stage. He told the road manager, as he passed him, to arrange full refunds for anyone who wanted them. He did not say why. The road manager did not ask. Then James Brown went to his dressing room, and the night was over, and the conversation about what had happened did not occur. Not that night, not in the weeks that followed, not in the months and years that stretched the silence out to a length that eventually became, in the small world of people who track these things, a kind of legend. Robert Gaines had grown up in the same world that James Brown had grown up in. Not the same city, not the same specific circumstances. Robert was from a small town in Georgia, rather than Augusta, had come up through a different set of Southern venues and connections and encounters with the music industry in its various forms. But the same world in the sense that mattered. The world of black musicians in the American South in the 1950s and 1960s, which was a world of real talent, operating in conditions that were not designed to recognize or sustain it. What that world produced in the people who moved through it long enough was a specific kind of knowledge. Not the knowledge that comes from success or from having your work acknowledged and built upon and carried forward into the culture. The knowledge that comes from having played, really played, with full commitment and genuine craft, in rooms that are now gone, for audiences that no one documented, on bills that no one preserved, in the specific and irretrievable privacy of a musical life that existed completely and left almost no record. The knowledge of your own playing, held without external confirmation, sustained by nothing except the internal certainty that the thing you did was real, even though the world that would have proved it no longer exists. James Brown had come from that world. He had been one of the ones who made it out of it and into a different kind of existence, which is to say, an existence where the record of your work is continuous and cumulative and publicly available in a form that can be pointed to. He had not forgotten, and the evidence that he had not forgotten is the entire shape of how he performed and what he performed for, and the specific seriousness with which he treated every performance, regardless of whether 12 people or 12,000 were watching. Robert Gaines had navigated that world for 2 decades. Robert Gaines had navigated that world for 2 decades. He had played guitar in clubs and on touring packages and in the background of recording sessions that credited other people. He had been, by the accounts of musicians who worked alongside him in those years, genuinely skilled in the way that many people who never become well known are genuinely skilled, with a specific and personal relationship to the instrument that was his and nobody else's, that had been developed in the particular conditions of his particular life, and that bore the marks of those conditions in the way that all real artistic ability bears the marks of what formed it. By September of 1976, the conditions of Robert Gaines's life had changed. Not gradually, not through any single dramatic event, but through the accumulation of the things that accumulate when a person spends 20 years in a world that does not protect them and does not compensate them fairly and does not account for what happens to people when the work stops. He was in the loading area of that arena for reasons that were simultaneously simple and comprehensive. He had nowhere else to be that evening. He had ended up in the vicinity of a large event without a ticket and without a plan, and the loading dock had presented itself as a place where a person could sit without being asked to leave. James Brown recognized him. This is the part of the story that requires a moment to absorb, because it means that James Brown, performing for 12,000 people, with the full attention required by that kind of performance, had seen through a gap in the staging at a distance of at least 30 feet, in a dimly lit loading area, a face that he knew from 20 years earlier, in a world that no longer existed in any continuous or organized way. He recognized him, and he stopped performing and walked toward him. What this recognition required, from where James was standing, is worth sitting with. 30 feet of distance, a gap in the staging, dim lighting, 20 years since the last time these two men had been in the same space. James Brown was in the middle of performing for 12,000 people, his attention tracking the crowd and the band and the physical mechanics of what he was doing simultaneously. And through all of that, through the noise and the light and the complete occupation of performing at full capacity, he looked through a gap and saw a face he had not seen in 20 years, and he knew it immediately. Not after a second look. Immediately. The way you know the faces of people who were part of the material your memory was built from, and that material does not become unavailable even when you stop consulting it. He recognized him, and he stopped performing and walked toward him. Patricia Rowe, the music historian who spent 3 years assembling this account in the early 2000s, tracked down Robert Gaines through a combination of historical records, interviews with musicians who had worked the same circuit, and the specific assistance of a music archivist in Georgia who had been documenting the careers of working musicians in the region since the 1980s. She found him in 2005 in a residential care facility in rural Georgia, and he was 81 years old, and his memory of most things was partial and unreliable. His memory of September of 1976 was precise. He described the loading area. He described the equipment cases. He described the sound of the concert, muffled through the building's walls, the bass frequencies carrying farther than the rest. He described a man crouching down in front of him in the specific way that you describe something when you have replayed it many times across many years. He said James Brown had asked him his name, then his town, then what he had been doing since the last time they had seen each other, which Robert placed at some time in the late 1950s, at a venue in Georgia that he named with a specificity that Rowe was able to verify. He said the asking of these questions had been done in a way that expected real answers, not the social performance of interest that people sometimes offer as a kind of courtesy. James had wanted to know, and he had listened to the answers with the kind of attention that changes a conversation from an exchange into something more like a reckoning. What James Brown said before he left is the part of the story that Robert Gaines repeated with the most precision. He said it the same way each time Rowe returned to it in the interview, with the word-for-word consistency of something that has been revisited so many times across so many years that it has become fixed. Fixed not as a memory, but as a possession. Something that belongs to you in the specific way that things belong to you when they were given at a moment when you needed them completely and kept you company for the next 3 decades. James Brown said, "The years you played, Robert, those years are real. They don't belong to what happened after. They're yours and they stay yours. I'm glad I got to tell you that." Then he stood, then he left. Patricia Rowe's article was published in a small but respected music history journal in 2006, the year James Brown died. It was read by a few thousand people within the world of music scholarship, and by a slightly larger number of dedicated James Brown enthusiasts. It did not make major news. It was not the kind of story that the entertainment press finds easy to package. There was no dramatic confrontation, no revelation of wrongdoing, no twist that simplified into a headline. Just a man who stopped performing for 12,000 people to sit on a concrete floor with one person, and who kept the reason private for 30 years, not to protect himself, but to protect the person the gesture was for, to give Robert Gaines something that belonged entirely to Robert Gaines, and that the public narrative of a famous man's compassion would have converted into something else. The people who read the article and who knew James Brown's work tended to respond in the same way. Not surprise, recognition. The feeling of a story that, once you hear it, explains something you could already feel in the music but couldn't name, Something in the specific gravity of a man who had always performed as though the 12,000 people in front of him were every person he had ever known, and the one person in the parking lot, and himself at 16, and the whole accumulation of a world that the music was both about and for. He walked off a stage to sit with one person. He kept it private for 30 years. He gave that person something small enough to carry and permanent enough to last. That was James Brown, right up until the end. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And tell us in the comments, has someone ever shown up for you in a way you didn't expect, at a moment when it mattered more than they could have known? We read every single one.